Hi there, good afternoon. This is afternoon, but it looks like midnight because I'm in my spa and it's really dark the way I love it. Anyway, welcome back to Unbridled, a midnight rodeo. And today I'm just going to let you know a little bit that I'm not going to be doing this chronologically. I'm going to be telling stories from my life. So however they come to me is how I want to bring them to you. And since Mother's Day is right around the corner, I have a little story that I wrote. It's a narrative, and I wrote it in, I think it was, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, but it happened to me in 2009. So it's very reflective, and it's probably the thing that has had the most impact on me in my life, the realization. So I'll get to that. I'm just going to read it to you and then I'll talk a little bit about it, but I think reading it is the most important part. So here you go, and I hope you enjoy this. It's called A Girl and Her Mother's Dream. I remember what that moment felt like as I was staring at a painting on my wall and letting go. I suppose it was a form of mourning, a stage of grief. It was sadness. It was a feeling of resolution. It was acceptance. I was also sort of numb. I felt like I was watching someone else go through the motions as I took the beloved painting down, the symbolic remnant, and propped it against the wall. It had an antiqued and weathered wood frame with a matte silver finish and small bronze gold veins that ran through it. The veins were barely visible, camouflaged by years of weather and wear, nicks and gouges here and there. When I think of that frame at this moment, it reminds me of my insides, then and now, threadbare. I also remember the happy day I hung my precious salvaged find. It was on a different wall in a different apartment, but it held the same meaning for all those 10 years. I decided it would be the central figure on the big blank space that I was going to make into a gallery wall. I carefully picked out a spot, pounded a nail, probably with whatever I could find that was heavy enough to plunge it into the old plaster, slipped my hand under the wire and back to pull it out just enough for me to plop it down. It hung firmly on that slim stem, perfectly poised. I never used a level or measured, still rarely ever do. It's like a little game I play with myself. I eyeball it, hang it, then stand back and check out my handiwork. I can hang anything within a centimeter, maybe even a few millimeters of perfection. A talent of minuscule worth, known only to me. A wee bit of ego and pride fans inside like the plumes of a proud peacock as my chest swells a little when I nail it on that first try. I remember that feeling of accomplishment as I stood back and took it all in. Hands on my hips, chin cocked up just a little, and tilted a bit to the side to gain that perfect vantage point. You know the stance. I was just barely over 30, and I was seeing my whole life ahead of me. I am now on the precipice of 50 and have been reflecting on my life a lot. Today I'm sitting on a crowded airplane full of strangers' chatter and jarring laughter, remembering that painting and all it stood for during that long decade. It was propped against the wall while I gathered a few special books, all for my yard sale. One book was a fable about a bluebird, and the other was a children's book about the story of Robert the Bruce. He is a very, very distant relative on my father's side, my late father. My dad and his dad were both named Robert Bruce. Both are deceased now. Granddad 48 years ago, and Dad just a little over a year ago. I had planned to share our family's history. And this exciting story with my toddler one day. Sorry, I get emotional when I read this one. My hands and heart felt heavier than the load in my arms as I carried the painting and the books outside and down the stairs to the sidewalk that faced the ocean. I sadly put them with the other things in my life that I was ready to let go of. I wasn't sad to let go of the other things, but those books and the painting, releasing those treasures made me sad. I didn't share my feelings with my mother or my friends that day, or ever, actually. I put on my cowgirl hat that went so well with my little red sundress with the white polka dots, turned up the country music, and propped up my handmade sign that read, "Texas or Bust." My life had changed drastically, and I was leaving my charming little hacienda at the beach in California for a stranger's home in Houston. I was happy and hopeful mostly, but during that small moment, I was sad. The old wooden frame held one of my precious dreams. It was a replica of a Picasso painting called Mother and Child. It was a line drawing of a maternal figure holding her precious baby. The background was a beautiful and swirling mixture of calming greens and yellows. It was serene. When I plucked it down from the wall of the vintage shop in Belmont Shore 20 years ago, I knew it would be perfect for my own baby's nursery wall someday. I pictured myself cradling my own child in that same way just before I laid her in her crib with the sound of the foghorns at the nearby port to lull her to sleep. Or as I slowly sat in the rocker and gazed at her while reading those books to her in the sweet silence that is the absolute middle of the night. As I made my way down the stairs, I felt the virtual emptiness inside as big as the actual emptiness of my insides. Just as that weathered old frame had held that woman and her child, my old weathered and worn womb had held only the dream of mine. The beloved painting and the books I had held on to for so many years would now be passed on to some other woman and some other child. They now fill space in some other homes, separated, adopted by different people who happily trotted off with them. Their visions were known to me. They were never known to me, as mine were a mystery to them. I hope they are cherished wherever they are now as much as they were cherished in my home then. Because you see, my dream had to be aborted. My womb had to be masterfully fractured, willfully torn, skillfully hunted down, and violently destroyed. The compassionate and earnest surgeon I journeyed to for a year had to become my bounty hunter. My diseased incubator inside was slowly killing me, and it had to be found and killed first. So just as the physical cradle of my imagined fetus and my dream of motherhood had died, so did the dream that precious old wooden frame held. I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me because although my dream was to be a mother, it was really the only thing I ever knew I wanted to be from the time I was a child, small child. There's something called collateral beauty, and collateral beauty was really coined, the phrase was coined for grieving, but there's all kinds of grieving. There's the loss of being able to have children. I definitely had to grieve that. And when you grieve and you have a huge loss like that, there are other things and other people that come into your life and other emotions that come into your psyche that can help to heal all that. And there are joys that are found that are just completely unexpected. They come from other people, other places, other chapters in your life, or other parts of your journey that would not have happened without that tragedy or that disaster or that death or that loss. So I've always been a pretty positive person, always tried to look for the positive in things because the world is just too cruel if I don't. You know, we all know that there's a lot of cruelty in this world. And if we concentrate on the cruelty, then we're bringing that negativity to ourselves and we're holding it on the inside. So what I chose to do, and I still choose to do, is to find the silver lining, to look for that collateral beauty, to look for the beauty that comes, that could only come because of that loss or that tragedy or that disaster, the illness, the, medical nightmare that I went through. I was misdiagnosed with endometriosis for actively misdiagnosed for 10 years, but I had it for a good 20 years before anybody found out what it actually was. and they thought I had cancer first, uterine cancer. So when I was sitting in the GYN oncologist's office waiting for the results with my mother, that was a really, really horrible moment to anticipate. And I thought, well, okay, if I have cancer, then I'm just going to, set a plan. We're going to talk about a treatment plan, and I'm just going to attack it. And I'm going to come out the other side well and healthy, and I'm going to live for a long time. So because I had that mindset, when I did find out that I didn't have cancer and it was just endometriosis, I was relieved. But I had no idea of the depth that had traveled inside my body. It was invisible, but the symptoms were not. The symptoms were everywhere. In my diet, felt bloated all the time, tons of pain, just chronic pain and really bad cycles. But even without the cycle, there was a lot of pain. I couldn't eat without significant pain. And I had no idea that all of my insides, all of my abdominal organs were included in this scar tissue that was just binding everything together. And my intestines were fused together. My liver was fused to my diaphragm. And every time I was on my cycle, I would have horrific pain up in this quadrant. And I was in countless emergency rooms and urgent care over the years, and nothing helped that pain, and nobody knew what it was. They kept telling me it was referred pain from a cyst in my ovary. So finally, I found a gynecologist that was willing to just go in and do surgery and fix it. Just take the cyst out or look to see what was wrong with me and the extent of it. Well, when she did that first surgery, she said that she couldn't move anything around. My intestines were solidified, they were fused together, and they were fused to all the organs around them. And we didn't know this yet, but on all of the imaging that we were looking at, the MRI, X-ray, ultrasound, CAT scans, with contrast and without contrast, everything that we did, they didn't know that my ovaries and uterus and fallopian tubes were buried under my intestines. They thought they were looking at my ovary, but it was my intestines wrapped around my ovary. So the very first surgery, my diagnosis was a matted pelvis. And she said she tried for 30 minutes to move my intestines around and couldn't. She couldn't separate them. She couldn't move them. She couldn't see what was under them. And then she referred me to another surgeon, and his name is Dr. Cameron Najat. He's in Palo Alto, and he was a clinical professor at Stanford University. The gynecologist that actually looked to find out what was wrong with me was Layla Zaffaranchi. And she is, I believe she's still in Northridge, California, and I had seen her in Aliso Viejo, California, Orange County. So she's the one who went to a conference about endometriosis, and she talked to Dr. Najat, who was the keynote speaker, and told him about my case, and he agreed to see me to do my surgery without having seen me first. He allowed her to do all of the pre-op, and then I had to fly to Northern California and have the surgery done. And in the very first one, it took 5 hours, I believe. It was supposed to be outpatient, and it was supposed to be outpatient in like 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours, he said. It ended up being 5 hours, and all he was able to do was separate my intestines, and they found a tumor in my fallopian tube that was the size of an orange, but it was benign, thankfully, thank God. But it was still damaging, and they did take that out. And then they had to set another surgery for me 6 months later, because during this first surgery with him, he did come out mid-surgery and talk to my parents and my ex-husband at the time. Well, he was my fiance at the time, but we did end up getting divorced. My marriage did not survive the whole medical crisis. So there was a lot of fallout from finding out that I was that ill and how dangerous it was. the doctor came out mid-surgery and asked my mother if he could perform a colostomy on me. And she asked if it was life or death. And he said, no, it wasn't life or death, but it was very, very serious. And they could wait about 6 months and then finish the surgery. So she said, if it's not life or death, I don't want Michelle to wake up to a colostomy without any notice or preparation for me mentally. And that was an amazing decision that she made. It's exactly what I wanted her to do, but we had no knowledge of how serious it actually was. My gynecologist, Dr. Zafranchi, had impressed on me that it's very, very, very serious and that I could die, because I did reschedule it once, and she was so upset with me. She said, Michelle, if you don't do this, if you don't schedule it and have it done, I know it's a disruption in your life. It's hard. It's going to be very difficult. But if you don't do that, you're going to be responding to an emergency, and it's going to be a life or death emergency, and there's going to be no preparation at all. And you could die. So I had so much work that I knew I was going to have to pay for all the time off, and I'm self-employed, so I was going to have to pay rent at the salon while I was in my recovery, and I had to prepare for all of that. And I just was in my busy season at the time. So I rescheduled it, canceled it. And she said, you need to reschedule it right away. So I did reschedule it for 6 weeks later. So my first surgery was in September of 2008 with him. The first surgery with all of this was in March of 2008. And then I had the third surgery and the final surgery in March of 2009. And that's the one that he had to prep me for. And that was another part of the journey. I'll talk about that some other time. But I had to drive up to Northern California to meet my surgeons. And I decided to stay in a lighthouse because I'm obsessed with lighthouses in the ocean and just the lore of lighthouses. And I decided to stay in a lighthouse and make the trip about that, then focusing on my illness and having to meet my surgeons, the rest of the team. And that mentally helped me a lot. I found a way to enjoy that, and I took a road trip with my mom. It was just overnight, but it was really, really good to do that. So when it all was said and done, my third surgery was 7.5 hours. And they had said that could probably be outpatient, but they weren't sure. So I did have to schedule a hotel, and they told me it would be about 5 days before I could go home. But I ended up having complications during surgery. I had fluid in my lungs and 2 blood transfusions. They had to do a bowel resection and remove 17 inches of my intestines. They had to take out my appendix, and I had a radical hysterectomy, so they took everything. I was 39 years old, and I woke up in menopause. That was probably rougher than the surgery, but that's all under control now too. I had amazing doctors, and I'll tell you about him too. The Dr. Zafranchi referred me to a super specialist, and his name is Dr. Michael Kreichnick, and he is now part of UC Irvine, but at the time he was a practicing gynecologist and sex therapist. So she told me I needed him because he was clinically trained in psychology, and he was a sex therapist, and he was also a gynecologist. And he specialized in what he called survivor medicine. And he worked with cancer patients mostly, but she said that I needed him. So every time I would go in, after she finished with her part, which was just the initial post-op, she sent me to him, and then he would do my checkups for the next almost a year, about 8-9 months. And every time I went in to have an appointment with him, a physical appointment, medical appointment, he would also schedule a 30-minute clinical therapy session with me. And he talked to me about how to have sex after menopause and what that would bring, how to still have an orgasm when your cervix is gone and everything has changed. And then also just all the other symptoms that come from menopause, and dryness is one of those, the whole body, your skin, everything, internal and external. So coconut oil is your best friend. But he helped me so much, and I had an amazing team with all of these doctors. I had a surgeon, I wish I could remember his name, but I can't remember his name now. I only met him the one time, but from their cancer center, he was a colorectal surgeon who did the bowel resection, and I believe his name was Dr. Welton. And then I had a Dr. Payne, Payne, from Stanford's Cancer Center also. And he did a full reconstruction of my bladder because my bladder was encased in my uterus. My uterus was stuck to my back and to my intestines, but there were so many organs that were involved. I had to have my ureters. They had to put stents in my ureters, and your ureters are tubes that go from your kidneys to your bladder. So in order for my bladder to heal, and all of the work that they did on my kidneys and ureters, because they had to take off all the endometrial lesions and adhesions and scar tissue from all of these places. So really my whole abdomen was involved. And they put the stents in the ureters so that they could heal and not have to work. So that way, the gravity just brings the urine down and through the body and out the urethra. And then that third surgery, when I had complications, I was in intermediate ICU for 5 days. And honestly, those 5 days on morphine were like a vacation compared to how I felt before any of my surgeries and all the pain that I dealt with. It was horrible. It was horrible. I've talked to women that have had children and endometriosis, and they said that endometriosis in the intestines feels worse than childbirth. And the way I used to describe it was that it felt like Freddy Krueger had my intestines and he was wringing them out, and then he would use his talons, those blades, and just scrape against them and dip them in alcohol. That's what it felt like every time I ate, or if I was digesting food. That's what it felt like all the time. So being in the hospital and having no work to do and no house to clean, no traffic to contend with, and people bringing me my food, and I just took naps and read, and I watched The Property Brothers all day long. It was kind of funny because I haven't watched it since, but that was my favorite thing to do out there. And then I also would take all my apparatus, like the IV and everything that I had to take with me, and I used to walk to this chair that was right by a window, and I would take a book with me or a magazine or something. And it overlooked Palo Alto, which is a really beautiful city. And the grounds for Stanford Hospital are very beautiful. And there were lots of trees and foliage and greenery outside the window. And I would sit in that chair facing the window and just look outside and kind of meditate. And I would read. And they had me up every hour walking. So then I would go back to the bed, and I had a morphine at will. And honestly, that did feel more comforting and soothing than my life did otherwise. And I was there for 5 days, and then I stayed another 5 days in a hotel with my mom before I could fly home. And then I flew home to my ex-husband, who actually never came to the hospital. It was a 5-hour drive. And if the roles were reversed and he had surgery and it was life-threatening and he almost died and had all those complications and was in ICU for 5 days, I would have been in the car and I would have been there. He never came to the hospital at all, not once. And I made a decision then. I knew I would be divorcing him, and that surgery was 6 weeks after we got married. His family still doesn't know what happened. They think that I used him to get through all these surgeries and that I left when I was well. But that's not true. I loved him deeply, and I was deeply disappointed and sad, heartbroken when he didn't come to the hospital. And I knew at that moment that I couldn't rely on him ever again. Like the trust that was broken by that was bigger than any other trust I could have even imagined. And sometimes when I tell people that infidelity isn't the bottom line for me, I remember that type of a situation, and not being able to trust your partner to take care of your well-being or to have compassion and empathy for you and step in when you can't take care of yourself. To me, that is a much worse broken bond than a sexual or love bond. Like if he had fallen in love with someone else, I probably would have been sad, but I would have wished him well and hoped that he had a good life, and I would have moved on. This not only broke my spirit, it broke my heart too. And I knew I was alone in a marriage. And being married and feeling that alone is worse than actually being alone, much worse. And I will believe that till the day I die, because I lived it. And it feels empty and abandoned. I was abandoned in my house, and he was right there next to me. He didn't help in my recovery. I asked him to grocery shop and vacuum for me because I couldn't lift over 10 pounds, and we lived upstairs, and I couldn't bring the groceries up by myself, and he wouldn't even do that. I had to wear a catheter for 3 weeks, and he told me that he never wanted to see it, never wanted to help me with it, never wanted to deal with it at all. He said it just grossed him out, and basically I was on my own. And after that, I was supposed to be out of work for 6 weeks. He talked to me a lot about how awful my job was because I was self-employed, and he thought I shouldn't have to pay rent at the salon while I was in my recovery. And I said, well, that's silly. I rent a business space. It's like if you rent your home or you pay a mortgage on your home and you take a vacation, you don't stop paying just because you're not there, physically there. So I was trying to explain that to him, and he just bitched about everything all the time and wanted me to quit and find some other job, do something else. And he wasn't there. He was barely there financially. And I ended up going back to work 3.5 weeks after my surgery instead of 6 because I couldn't take his bitching. And I knew that I was going to tell him to move out. I knew that our marriage was over. So I knew I had to get back to work and figure out what I was going to do next anyway. And I'm a really strong person. Physically strong, mentally strong, and intellectually strong, pretty emotionally strong. But at that moment, I was very fragile and I was angry. I was hurt and angry and sad. And I guess it was about 4 months after my surgery that I told him to move out. Like, you need to just leave. And he met me just a month before I was diagnosed. So at the time, we still thought I might have cancer. And I met him in a bar, and he asked me out, and I said, you don't want to go out with me. I might have cancer. I probably can never have children. And he said that was not a problem. He didn't care about things like that. Like, everybody in life has issues. We all have struggles, and that if I didn't have children, that didn't matter to him. And that if I was ill, he could handle that, because believe it or not, his mother had 3 sisters, and 3 out of 4 daughters in that family had severe endometriosis like I did, and they had all had hysterectomies. And only his mother and 1 aunt were able to have children. The other 2 couldn't have children, and they had hysterectomies also before they were 40. So this was not new to him, and that was the reason that he asked me to marry him. And he said that he wanted me to know that he was in it for the long haul, and that he wouldn't leave no matter how I ended up after these surgeries. Even with a colostomy, he said he would stay. Well, I'm glad I didn't have that colostomy, and I'm glad I found out early in our relationship that I couldn't count on him. So 4 months after our wedding, no, after my surgery, 6 months after our wedding, I told him to move out. And his family thought I was the bad person. And I didn't feel like defending myself or justifying myself. They didn't know me well, and they were not curious. So I wasn't going to plead my case to them. I just divorced him and said good riddance to the whole thing. And I decided to move to Texas. So that gets us to this point. So when all of that happened and I had nothing to consider anymore except for my own well-being, my own desires, my own heart, and to think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, it was such a turning point. Because up until that point, I think a lot of women can relate to this. Up until that point, when I was dating, I knew I wanted to be a mother. So when I would date, I would always think about in terms of like whether the man would be a good father or not, where I lived, what kind of school district was it? What did I do for a living? Because I knew I wanted to stay home with my children as much as possible. So I chose to become an esthetician because I knew that schedule was flexible. It was something that I loved and I was passionate about. And I could be my own boss when I needed to be. Or there were lots of other options like working at a resort or a hotel or med spa or the neighborhood salon, some kind of a spa. I just felt like it was a good choice for me. And all of a sudden, I didn't have to consider any of that. I didn't have to save for my child's college education. I didn't have to worry about what school zone I lived in. I didn't have to worry about whether the man wanted children or not, or if he would be a good father. Of course, those characteristics make a good husband too, usually. Not always. But they say whether that person is, evil or not, or serious or not about a relationship and commitment and responsibility. And all of a sudden, all of that was gone. And I felt this surge of liberation and freedom. And so this is part of that collateral beauty that I was talking about. When I realized I didn't have to think about anything except what I wanted in life, it felt almost selfish, but it was my reality. So I thought, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I was 39 years old when I had my hysterectomy and 38 when I was diagnosed. And I thought, wow, I could have another 40 years or even 50 years. My mother's side of the family lives a long time. My dad's mother was 86 when she passed away, and my grandmother was 93. And my grandfather on my mom's side he had sisters, and they all lived into their 90s, even their late 90s, 97, 96. So I feel like I'm going to live a long ass time, and I'm happy about that. Because it was like I was reborn, and I was given this gift of liberty and freedom and just to follow my heart's desire. And I thought, well, what do I want to do? And not just desire, but how do I find purpose now? Being a mother, to me, was the highest honor and the most important thing that anyone can do in life. And I now see that is not the case. I still hold it in very, very high esteem. I think being a parent is probably the hardest job in the world, for sure. But I don't think it's the only honorable or important thing. And when I was talking to my surgeon right before the surgery, the last surgery, I had to make a decision about complete hysterectomy or not. And he asked if I wanted to have my eggs harvested and frozen, because then I could use a surrogate later, because they did have to take my uterus. I knew that, but I had the choice to have a child through surrogacy and a sperm donor or something. And I decided no, I didn't want that. And as you'll hear more about other aspects of my life, at the time I was going through all of this, I was helping to take care of a friend of mine from junior high school. And he had ALS. And I started to help take care of him when he was already paralyzed and he couldn't talk anymore. He had lost his ability to speak. But when someone has ALS, their mind is fully intact, and actually their sensory nerves are all intact also. They can feel everything, but their motor nerves die slowly and they can't move anymore. So they're trapped inside their body. And he was put on hospice, given 6 months to live, And his wife of 7 years, someone he'd been with for 10 years, she left. It was one of the most horrific things I had ever heard of. And I got an email from one of my friends from school telling the story about how his wife left, and she was asking for donations for his house because she also took all the furniture, the money that was in the account, except for $200. And that's a whole other story about their journey and about Frank. His name was Frank. And he had a phrase that he used all the time, and that was big fat love. So on this channel or another room in this channel, if you see big fat love, that is the story about Frank and that whole ordeal that I went through with him and with myself, and all of the magnificent things that happened from that. More Collateral Beauty. It was an incredible experience that I would never, ever trade for anything in the world, not even the ability to have children. So I'll tell those stories on the other side, different time. But this, knowing that I couldn't count on him, knowing that I was going to be alone, knowing that I had to find purpose in my life, and I was already helping to take care of a man who was in hospice, who couldn't feed himself, who couldn't speak. I would go usually at least once a month, but sometimes I would go more often than that. I had Mondays off, so I would go a lot of Mondays. And I would take movies, and we would watch movies together, and they were always funny. I always took him funny movies like Step Brothers or Wild Hogs. He loved that one because he rode a Harley, and he loved that one. He was laughing so hard at that one, and he spit food out his nose one time because he was laughing so hard at a scene in that movie. And to bring joy to someone else who is going through something much worse than I was going through, to me felt like purpose. That was my purpose. And when I spoke to my surgeon about that, when he asked about me having a surrogate and my own children, I said, no, because God made me this way for some reason. And it's up to me to find that purpose now. And I believed then, and I firmly believe it now even more, that I'm here to help take care of other people. I have a gift that I don't know where it came from. I never really knew about it until I was doing a facial on someone who had just been released from the hospital, and she had a traumatic brain injury and a horrific car accident. She'd been in the hospital for a long time. So her mother asked me to do a facial on her, and that was my first experience with working someone who was very fragile and tender, and I had to be very, very careful with everything I put on her, how I touched her, how I spoke to her, all of it. It was all so important. And out of that, this was about 3 years before I started to help take care of Frank, and I took care of him for 22 months before he passed away. And one of the things that I did for him was I would always do hand and foot reflexology massages for him. And at the time, I didn't even know that he could feel everything, but it was definitely therapeutic. And I knew that the circulation and the blood flow and the oxygenation would be good for him anyway. And reflexology has pressure points that correspond to all of our organs in our body. And there's a definite spiritual alignment and physical alignment that comes from it. So his mother told me that every time that I was there during the day and he got his massages, that he would always sleep through the night. And I just was so immersed in caring for him, and it did give me a sense of purpose. And as he's going through his ordeal, he was dying. He was actively dying. I know that's an oxymoron, but we were all watching him waste away, and he knew it. You know, he knew he would never be cured. He knew he was going to die. And it was a horrible death that he had to look forward to. I mean, the way someone with ALS passes is either because fluid gets in their lungs and they drown, or they can't swallow and they can't breathe. So he knew that he had that to look forward to. And when I was helping to take care of him, he asked me one time to go with him to the healer that he used to see. It was a spiritual healer. And I thought he wanted me to go because he wanted someone to help with the wheelchair and just, escort him. And I had never done anything like this before. I'd never taken care of anyone in a wheelchair or that was paralyzed or couldn't speak, all of that. And I just took one step out in faith and love and empathy and compassion every time I did something with him. And every time I did something with him, I learned more about how to take care of people and more about myself. I didn't know that I was capable of that. And it ended up being, I'm getting emotional now. It was the most fulfilling and the most important thing I've ever done in my life. And it's something that I would never, ever, ever trade. When I was at the healer with him, I was sitting in the room and I watched the whole session. And then later that night, he was able to email at this point because he would wear the glasses that had the chip on it. And he had that machine that would talk for him. And he emailed me and said, thank you for going with them. And I said, no, thank you for allowing me and inviting me. And I asked him how it was going for him. Like, how did he feel after that? And he said that he didn't invite me for him. He invited me because he thought I needed the healing. And to be with someone who is dying, and needs a lot of care. He needed care for everything. He couldn't do anything by himself at all. To be with someone in that kind of situation and know that he invited me to help me floored me. He cared about me in a way that my husband had no idea to do. It wouldn't even occur to my husband, or really any man that I had met at that point, up to that point. And over these 22 months, I fell in love with him. And I'll tell you about that later. So the impact that this had on me was huge. Not just Frank, but the whole medical trauma, the journey, the years that it took me to find out what was wrong and to go through everything and come out the other side, and to know that I was healthy and healthier than I had been since I was a teenager. And I came out stronger and more resilient and more loving and more spiritual. My relationship with God was really born at that time. I was very defiant against church and religion because I had had a bad experience growing up, and I really had no interest in that. So not only did it help to heal me emotionally and psychologically, but spiritually too. And Frank and I fell in love with each other during this whole experience. And there has never been a bigger gift in my life than that. So I made the decision to sell everything I owned that didn't fit in my car. I filed for divorce, and that was very amicable. He and I did it together. We paid $300 for the filing fee. We didn't have anything to split except for our Dave Chappelle DVDs because we both loved the Chappelle Show. He got season 1, I got season 2. And we said goodbye. And we actually stayed friendly for several years. That's another part of the journey that I'll tell you about later. But I was so happy, and I felt a surge of joy that I had never known. And freedom, like I said before, just freedom and liberty and what do I want to do with my life? And I made the decision to sell everything I own. I packed up my car and I went to live with my friend's sister in Houston, and I had never even met her. I had my dog and all my stuff in my car, and I met her when I pulled up in the driveway. And it was amazing. It was amazing. I knew I wanted to buy a motorcycle, and I wanted to travel, and I wanted to help veterans. And I did ride with the Patriot Guard on my motorcycle, and that was really awesome. Honored our veterans. And I did start working with hospice patients, volunteering for hospice, and I work with cancer patients, and I still do that now. So 16 years later, my life has never been better. I have never been better physically, emotionally, spiritually. And it started with a tragedy. So don't focus on the loss. Don't focus on the pain. Don't focus on the tragedy. Find the silver lining. It's there. I promise. Till next time.